Bergen-Belsen was the first camp to be liberated by Allied forces. Until then, the only descriptions of what happened in these places came from the Red Army, composed of soldiers from the Soviet Union who had witnessed with their own eyes the horrors of these death temples established in Poland. The fighters already knew that the Third Reich was brutal in battle, but it was hard to believe some of the stories told by Stalin's men. However, to their surprise, what they found was even worse. We warn that the images and reports we are about to learn are incredibly brutal, but if you are ready to discover everything that the victims suffered in this camp, including the story of a very well-known figure who died there, get ready! The Nazi guards at Bergen-Belsen, after the liberation, went from oppressors to prisoners of the Allied forces, accused of the greatest atrocities. A striking testimony was that of Gina Turgel, a Polish citizen who escaped the gas chamber at Auschwitz but was sent to Bergen-Belsen. She described her arrival at the camp. "We were told to enter a huge, empty tent with no beds, mattresses, or blankets. There were no windows, only glassless openings. My mother and I found a corner and slept there, exhausted. The next morning, I woke up and couldn't believe what I saw. Literally walking skeletons and piles of bodies heaped together. It was impossible to tell if they were men or women." Katarina Hardy, after recovering, reported, "In the concentration camp, what was normal wasn't life. Normal was death. I don't see the world the way others do. In fact, I belong to the dead of Bergen-Belsen." Katarina believed in the constant presence of the afterlife, a result of seeing corpses daily and hearing the constant gunfire used to execute those no longer able to perform forced labor. When British and Canadian troops finally entered the camp, they found more than 13,000 unburied bodies, and, including the satellite camps, around 60,000 prisoners, most severely ill and starving. The prisoners had gone without food or water for days before the Allies' arrival, partly due to Allied bombings. Immediately before and after the liberation, prisoners were dying at a rate of about 500 per day, mostly due to typhus. The scenes that awaited the British troops were described by BBC's Richard Dimbleby, who accompanied them. Here, in more than an acre of ground, lay dead and dying people. It was impossible to distinguish one from the other. The living lay with their heads resting on corpses, and around them moved the terrible and ghostly procession of skeletal people, aimless, with nothing to do and no hope of life, unable to get out of their own way, unable to look at the horrors around them. Babies had been born here, small, withered creatures that could not survive. A mother, driven mad, screamed at a British guard asking for milk for her child and pushed the small being into his arms, then ran off crying desperately. He opened the bundle and discovered the baby had been dead for days. This day in Belsen was the most horrible of my life. In 1935, the Wehrmacht began constructing a large military complex near the village of Belsen, part of the town of Bergen. This complex became the largest military training area in Germany at the time and was used for armored vehicle training. The barracks were completed in 1937. The site has been in continuous operation ever since and is now known as the Bergen-Hohne Training Area, being used by NATO armed forces. The workers who built the original buildings were housed in camps near Fallingbostel and Bergen, the latter being the so-called Bergen-Belsen Army Construction Camp. Once the military complex was completed in 1938 to 1939, the workers' camp fell into disuse. However, after the German invasion of Poland in September 1939, the Wehrmacht began using the huts as a prisoner of war camp. The hut camp near Fallingbostel became known as Stalag 11B and grew into one of the largest prisoner of war camps operated by the Wehrmacht, housing up to 95,000 prisoners from various countries. In June 1940, Belgian and French prisoners of war were housed in the former Bergen-Belsen construction workers' camp. This facility was significantly expanded starting in June 1941, when Germany was preparing to invade the Soviet Union, becoming an independent camp known as Stalag 11C. It was designed to hold up to 20,000 Soviet prisoners of war and was one of 3 such camps in the region. The others were located in Urbka and Wietzendorf. By the end of March 1942, around 41,000 Soviet prisoners of war had died in these 3 camps due to starvation, exhaustion, and disease. By the end of the war, the total death toll had risen to 50,000. When the prisoner of war camp in Bergen ceased operations in early 1945, after the Wehrmacht handed it over to the SS, the cemetery contained more than 19,500 dead Soviet prisoners. In the summer of 1943, Stalag 11C was dissolved, and Bergen-Belsen became an extension of Stalag 11B. It served as a hospital for all Soviet prisoners of war in the region until January 1945. Other internees' patients included detainees from August 1944 onwards, and after the suppression of the Warsaw Uprising in October 1944, around 1,000 members of the Polish Home Army were imprisoned in a separate section of the prisoner of war camp. In April 1943, part of the Bergen-Belsen camp was taken over by the SS Central Office for Economic Administration. Thus, the camp became part of the concentration camp system administered by the SS Schutzstaffel, but with a special status. Initially designated as a Civil Interniertenlager, in June 1943 it was reclassified as an Aufenthaltslager, since the Geneva Conventions stipulated that the former type of facility had to be open to inspection by international committees. This transit camp, or exchange camp, was intended for Jews who were to be exchanged for German civilians interned in other countries, or for hard currency. Between the summer of 1943 and December 1944, at least 14,600 Jews, including 2,750 minors, were transported to the Bergen-Belsen transit or exchange camp. The internees were forced to work, many of them in the so-called shoe commando, which salvaged usable leather from shoes collected throughout Germany and occupied Europe. In general, prisoners in this part of the camp were treated with less brutality than other classes of prisoners at Bergen-Belsen until the end of the war, due to their potential value for exchanges. However, only about 2,560 Jewish prisoners were actually released from Bergen-Belsen and allowed to leave Germany. In March 1944, part of the camp was reclassified as an Erholungslager, where prisoners too ill to work were brought from other concentration camps. Allegedly, they were at Belsen to recover and then returned to their original camps to resume work. But many died in Belsen due to disease, starvation, exhaustion, and lack of medical care. In August 1944, a new section was created, becoming the so-called Women's Camp. In November 1944, this camp received about 9,000 women and girls. Most of those who were fit to work stayed only for a short time and were then sent to other concentration or forced labor camps. The first women interned were Polish, imprisoned after the failed Warsaw Uprising. Others were Jewish women from Poland or Hungary, transferred from Auschwitz. Margot and Anne Frank died in this camp in February or March 1945. Under Kramer's command, Bergen-Belsen ceased to be considered merely a facility to house prisoners and officially became a concentration camp run by the SS. During his tenure, the facilities were expanded again, but in January 1945, camps in Eastern Europe began to be evacuated due to the advance of the Red Army. About 85,000 prisoners were transported in cattle cars to Bergen-Belsen, and many others were forced to march on foot. The long and harsh march, combined with the critical state of the prisoners, resulted in many deaths along the way. The camp had turned into a true hell, where the lack of food, hygiene, the brutality of the guards, disease, and even medical experiments contributed to the killings. To understand the last chaotic months in Bergen-Belsen before the end of the war, we can look at some numbers. In February 1945, there were approximately 22,000 prisoners in the camp. With the arrival of detainees evacuated from other complexes where the enemy was advancing, this number exceeded 60,000 by mid-April. However, during that same period, tens of thousands died, raising the total number of victims of Nazi cruelty in Bergen-Belsen to about 100,000 people. This dark chapter of history ended on April 15, 1945, with the arrival of British forces who liberated the camp. When Allied troops entered the camp, they encountered a horrifying scene. Thousands of corpses scattered around, while living prisoners could barely move, almost indistinguishable from the dead. A poignant example was the case of Hungarian violinist Katarina Hardy, captured for being Jewish. When the British arrived, she was only 16 years old, weighed 29 kilograms, and was lying on the ground with her legs bent, unable to straighten them or stand up. She also couldn't swallow and therefore couldn't eat. After being taken to a military hospital, Katarina managed to regain some weight and improve. She survived, escaping being just another number among the victims. German nursing staff were also forced to care for the victims. The women could smile for the first time in years. The darkest stage seemed to have ended for these prisoners, but the aftermath would follow them for the rest of their lives, as they had been the targets of brutal sterilization experiments. The Nazi plan was to prevent the Jewish population from continuing to reproduce, whether among couples or as a result of the cruel violations committed by German guards, who subjected them to constant sexual abuse. The SS doctors were aware of Adolf Hitler's desire to preserve his beloved Aryan race, and therefore began searching for different methods to prevent Jewish women from having children. Among these methods, they tested overexposure to X-rays, surgeries, or injections with irritating chemical products that caused severe inflammation, resulting in immense pain and permanent damage to reproductive organs. On top of all this suffering, test subjects were often murdered so that autopsies could be performed and results compared between different bodies. The tortures at Bergen-Belsen were on par with all German concentration camps, but we must remember that this was the first camp to be liberated by Allied troops. For this reason, it was also the one that revealed the brutal secrets of Nazi treatment of prisoners. Soviet Red Army soldiers had already encountered other complexes in occupied territories as they advanced through Eastern Europe. However, the Western forces, who began to march through Germany after the Normandy landings, still did not know what happened inside these death factories. For this reason, when the camp was discovered, the Americans, led by General Dwight Eisenhower, wanted to show the world the brutality experienced within its gates. At that point, the war was practically over. Just 2 weeks after the liberation of Bergen-Belsen, Adolf Hitler took his own life to avoid being captured by Stalin's troops, who had already entered Berlin. All the secrets of the Führer's atrocious regime began to be revealed. Although many Germans who were part of the extermination machinery claimed not to know what happened inside the detention camps, the Americans decided to confront them with the truth. Delegations composed of US government and German representatives toured every corner of the camp. The completely emaciated corpses were the clearest reflection of the suffering endured by the prisoners. Among the locations visited was the area specially prepared to burn piles of lifeless bodies, reducing the volume accumulated throughout the complex. If we set aside the early years of Bergen-Belsen's operation, when it served as a detention site for prisoners of war from invaded Poland, France, and Belgium, it is estimated that between 1943 and 1945, around 120,000 people passed through the camp. However, the names of only approximately 55,000 of them are known, that is, less than half. This happened because SS members destroyed a large portion of the records before the Nazi defeat. Only a few documents, hidden away, ended up in Allied hands. Although the data was limited, it brought some clarity to the families of Holocaust victims, who were searching for their loved ones with the hope of finding them alive. A large portion of the former SS personnel was tried by the British in the Bergen trial. During the period in which the camp operated as a concentration camp, at least 480 people worked as guards or members of the complex, including 45 women. From September 17th to November 17th, 1945, some of these individuals were tried in a military court in Lüneburg. Among the defendants were Commander Josef Kramer, 16 SS men, 16 female guards, and 12 former heads of various camp sectors. Many were accused not only of crimes committed in Bergen-Belsen, but also in Auschwitz. The substantial media coverage of the trial revealed details about the gas chambers of Auschwitz, as well as the mass killings at Bergen-Belsen. 11 of the defendants were sentenced to death, including Kramer. Their executions took place on December 13, 1945, in Hamelin. Another 14 were acquitted. Among the remaining 20, one was sentenced to life imprisonment, while the others received prison terms ranging from 1 to 15 years. However, most of the sentences were reduced on appeal or by clemency requests. Thank you very much for your audience. May God bless you all. A big hug, and see you soon.